normal tradition has been, whenever we have a guest on the show, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the guests. In our earlier seasons, I'd go ahead and do this whole big, put together this whole big paragraph about the person and blow them up as much as I can. But I think tonight it's going to be a bit more fitting if someone else does the intro.
All right.
And, Bryan.
Go on, Joey. You do it.
Bryan, I think, for reasons that will become obvious very shortly, I think it's going to make sense for Bryan to introduce our wonderful guest tonight.
I certainly will. So, I'm sure everybody knows that we tend to have guests on every 2 or 3 episodes, and it's mainly it's an exercise for us to learn and connect as well and sort of gain new skills. And it suddenly came to me, I'm like, why are we only looking within woodworking and making? Like, why don't we actually try to look at some business development opportunities? I'm like, who could we possibly get on the show that could give us some advice about
that person,
marketing or strategy or advertising or just something to help us with our businesses? I'm like, Lani, what are you doing on Tuesday night? So, everyone, this is my wife, Lani, strategic
Hello.
marketer extraordinaire. I'll let you give the spiel, but yeah, just a brief spiel of what you do.
Okay, that's Bryan saying I'm not prepared with that and don't really know what she does, but she can introduce herself.
I've never quite figured it out, so
Marketer.
this is the moment where it all makes sense.
That was a great introduction. Thanks, babe. Okay, so I have worked in the creative advertising industry for about 17 years or more now. And I currently hold a role as head of strategy and research. So I head up 2 teams at a creative agency at the moment. So I've worked in both creative agencies, so what we typically call advertising, as well as marketing, so what we call client side, heading up the marketing at a business school, as well as media strategy for a few years. So yeah, I'm a creative strategist at heart, and what that means is that I help clients to figure out what their objectives are, what they're trying to do, who they're talking to, what they should be therefore saying, and then I work with creative teams to figure out some really cool ways of saying it. So that's me in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm. And I guess from the perspective of the listeners, a lot of them are either in the woodworking business or looking to get into the woodworking business, and this is a really interesting topic because people need to know how this all works.
And this usually costs a lot of money.
So let's get the questions in, or at least ask the right questions. And maybe that's a good place to start. Bryan, do you feel like you've been able to lean on Lani for advice and guidance with your own business?
Yeah, definitely. Especially when I first started and was applying for business grants. The one that switched me from being a part-time business to a full-time business. I remember this was the City of Melbourne application process, and I remember being completely overwhelmed by it. I'm like, well, I just want to make furniture. And Lani's like, no, you need your target market, you need your price points, you need to work out this whole story that sells your brand, not just as a business, but it needs to be connected together. The storytelling, the brand, the designs, like have an overarching theme to it. And yeah, it really, well, I wouldn't have got the grant without her help in it. But it's just always good to revisit at times, and we'll disagree on certain things, like any married couple do. Mm-hmm. But overall, it's an amazing resource to have at home, because like I said, most small businesses, whether they're creative businesses or what, you don't have the money to spend to hire somebody like Lani. So I just figured it would be useful for a lot of professionals out there to sort of hear how she thinks woodworking businesses and design businesses should market themselves. And
well, yeah. So, how do we get started? What is the? I guess maybe.
I see you've got a pen and paper
I've
for the first time
notes.
ever in a podcast.
I've got loads to talk about. You don't even need to ask me questions. It's fine.
I wonder, it might be an interesting perspective. What is the number one mistake that you see people coming in your industry, that people obviously come to a marketing agency thinking they have an idea and a point of view, and typically what I think I've found is that your point of view is not actually correct once you start answering the questions that you need answered. And so what's the biggest kind of mistake people have when they come into it? The idea of...
Yeah. That is a great question, Joey. And probably the biggest thing that I see is just not knowing what they're trying to do. So objectives. And to be honest with you, probably 9 times out of 10 clients don't have objectives, or they think they do, but they're not really relevant. And ultimately, in order to be successful, you need to know what you're working towards. For anyone, in whatever they're doing, even as an employee, you need some goals to work towards. But as a business, I think objectives are really important. And Bryan and I were having a great debate about this the other night when he asked me to be on the podcast, and I was sort of explaining business objectives and then how marketing objectives work to help with business objectives, and then how communications objectives help with marketing objectives. So what that means is business is all about growth and usually money or profit, and then marketing is kind of how you're going to get there. So it might be, I'm going to sell X amount of chairs or X amount of tables. Like, it's quite hard in a bespoke business to do that in order to get that growth over the next few years. And then in comms, what do you need to tell people? So when I say comms, communications, what do I need to tell people in order to sell those chairs? So you have kind of a few different objectives, but ultimately they need to be smart. And what I mean by smart is specific. It sort of spells out SMART, but it means specific, measurable, attainable, realistic and timely. So making sure that they're really specific goals, but also have time allocated to it. So I want to make this amount of profit by financial year 23 or something like that. And then you think about what you actually need to do to get there, and you kind of sort of form a path for yourself to do that. So yeah, objectives are probably the biggest mistake, but I think the second biggest thing that a lot of clients don't think about is what's the one thing they're trying to say. What's their single-minded message, as we call it in the industry? And that's quite often something they look to us and say, I don't know, like, can you tell me? Because I really want to tell them these 10 things. And we're like, well, you can't really tell them 10 things. You need to tell them one. And I'm specifically talking about creating like a TV ad or something like that. And obviously it changes depending on the medium. But I think ultimately it's just, what are you actually trying to say? And then the third and final mistake, gosh, there's a lot of them, sorry, is knowing your audience. So knowing who you're actually talking to and really understanding them is really, really important. So, and I don't just mean from a demographic perspective and thinking about, well, we're going to target, middle-aged, wealthy people, yada, yada, yada. It's more about, well, what are they actually thinking? What are their attitudes? What do they believe in? What are they feeling? What do they value? Because ultimately at the moment, particularly after the pandemic and even more so than before, that brands that align their values to their clients or their audience's values are much, much more successful than those that don't. And I can go on and on and on about that. So, yeah.
So,
do you want me to keep going?
Yeah, I've got a follow-up.
Keep talking.
How?
Okay, great.
I've been asked this question and it stumped me the first time, and I had to seriously go away and just like really work out the answer to this. And so how do you go about knowing, if you don't know, who your target market is? If you, for example, are just selling chairs online and you have one good chair that sells and you sell 10 a week, and you want to sell 100 a week, how do you know who they're going to? And so how do you know how to market to?
So, yeah, great question. So there's a couple of ways you can find out. I'd say if you're doing it online only, you can look at Google Analytics from a demographic perspective. It's not super accurate, but it's helpful, I suppose, as a first start. Other than that, you can ask them questions. So I would potentially start to think about following up a purchase with a survey, and you can call it a satisfaction survey or whatever you like. But you can start to kind of follow up those types of things and try and make a connection with your customers. The other option is to get them to sign up to some kind of newsletter or ongoing communications with you as well. And that would probably be my recommended approach, because then it means that you've almost got free marketing for ongoing sales. You build a database of people and clients that you can then connect with constantly, and you'll get to build a story around them. It's a bit tricky when you are selling online because you don't always have the data that you need. A lot of bigger companies tend to have a lot of data in place so that they can get a really good picture. But obviously that's not always available to smaller, furniture makers and the like. So I would say the more you can talk to your customers, the better, and find out how they found you, why they found you, was it through word of mouth, why were they interested in you, and just ask them questions. And I say that to Bryan all the time. I think it's really important to just understand who they are and why they're communicating with you, where they found you, those types of things, and start to kind of build a picture that way.
Yeah, I think at first a lot of, I think you feel quite nervous asking, like you're interrogating the client. Like,
we're all nodding.
Yeah. Where did you find my phone number? It should have been secret, And it seemed, and because that's what you do straight away, you're just like, oh, how did you find that about me? And the client tends to give you a 3 or 4 word sentence, and that's it. But you actually want to dive a bit deeper, and so having some form of newsletter or a form afterwards, satisfaction form, that's probably not the right term, but yeah, something like that, where you can get a bit more of a I've found getting testimonials from clients a really good way to actually see what they think about your work as well. For a start, if they're willing to give you a testimonial, then they're obviously happy. But then they often go into quite specific details about what they were impressed with, and it's kind of good take-home advice from that.
But you're also building your community in that sense as well, because you're saying to them, I value you so much that I want to know what you think about my work. So it's sort of that
definitely
double whammy.
Yeah, and there's also the other flip of the coin, where if you're starting a new business and you have no idea because you've never sold products before, or you just don't know, I think there's also planning and trying to understand who you could be targeting. So, the business plan that Bryan mentioned earlier, he had to guess who his audience was because he hadn't really sold a huge amount of furniture before. So I think you do that by looking at your values as a business or as an individual business owner, as well as kind of the products that you're making and who you think they're going to be suiting. So think about your price range, think about the type of things that you're making. So for example, if it's bespoke furniture, then you're potentially targeting a slightly more creative client, or a slightly more engaged client who is willing to take the time to kind of go along that design process with you. So there's kind of things like that you can think about as well, even before you've sold anything.
I remember one thing that you said to me was identify the people that you want to be in competition with, or the people that you sort of see your business aligning with.
Yeah.
Was one really important thing, seeing who they target, whether they use paid adverts or, I don't know, the kind of exhibitions and trade shows, or if they stock in retail, the types of places that they stock at. If you can identify what their price point is based on how many years they've been in business as well, and things like that.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually. So you think about where... for a terrible example, but you think about where McDonald's are located, there's always a KFC down the road, or, they're always located really closely together. And that's because they know their market really well, and they know that each other knows the market. So quite often they just copy each other. And when it comes to, I think that's a great point around competitors. So I know in the furniture industry, particularly in Australia, it's a really nice community though. And so I feel like using the term competitors feels really odd because it just doesn't feel right. And potentially New Zealand and overseas as well. Sorry, Joe, leaving you out. But yeah, I just feel like it's such a tight-knit community here that competitors isn't the right thing, but it's just aligning yourself with other brands.
Businesses you'd like to emulate.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't have to be furniture. It can be any brand or any kind of anyone that you look up to that you can sort of emulate. And obviously if it's furniture, great. And it could be overseas, it can be in Australia. But whenever we do strategy pieces for creative messaging, we always look at audience, we look at competitors, and we look at positioning alongside competitors. So how are you positioning yourself amongst a bunch of competitors? So even if you don't want to call them competitors, but you think about mapping out a bunch of different furniture makers across even the world, and think about, all right, well, where do I want to position myself compared to these guys? What's my point of difference? What am I selling that's interesting, that's going to make people stop and look at me as opposed to anyone else? So, you know, are you going to be a specialist? Are you going to be a generalist? Are you going to do bespoke? Are you just going to sell off the shelf? I think that's one thing. But then, you know, positioning in terms of, I want to position myself as the greenest furniture maker in the world, or in Australia, or in New Zealand. I want to position myself as the most, the best design process furniture, or, you know, there's, what is it about you that's different and interesting, I think is really important as part of that process.
Do you think it's really important to, again, I've had this advice and have not been able to follow it, always being told that you should find your niche and you should market that niche, and that's what you're going to be good at?
I'm so glad you touched on this, Joey, because this was one of my questions as well.
I cannot.
We had this conversation the other night.
I cannot do it. Because it's too boring for me. So I will take on all these crazy jobs, and it's complete havoc for marketing. Whenever I talk to someone to do a website, SEO or anything like that, they're just like, oh my God, you need to pick a thing. I go, no, I'm not picking a thing. I do all these things. And so, is it that my niche is that I do everything? Or am I just like back in the trend and don't really care about it?
I don't think you have to find a niche. I think entrepreneurs don't find a niche. They're constantly evolving. They're constantly developing new products or systems or thinking or ways of thinking. So I completely disagree that you need to find a niche. I think one example of how I can explain this, so I actually was telling Bryan about this the other day as well, is most companies know what they do. Most companies know how they do it, but not many know why they do it. And what I'm referring to, if any of you have ever seen, or any of your listeners have ever seen or heard of Simon Sinek's Golden Circle, I think it was in 2008 or 2009 or something. It was years ago that he presented it, and it changed the way businesses thought about themselves and they marketed themselves. And what you're talking about, Joey, is what you do. So you make a lot of different things, and that's okay, that's great. But how you do it, there's a bit of, you know, chaos about it, or there, you know, you know exactly what you're doing, and you do it through beautifully designed pieces that you know exactly how you make them. Or I don't quite know exactly how you kind of do what you do. You guys are all amazing, but then it's kind of getting to the why. And that's what's interesting, and that's what your website can talk about. It doesn't have to have all of your products. It doesn't have to include everything that you do. It has to talk about why you do what you do. So Simon Sinek's example is essentially, he talks about Apple as an example. I know it's a big brand and it's hard to relate to, but I'm going to use it because he uses it as an example and it's really easy to understand. So he says, you know, if you're going to sell Apple or an Apple laptop, just say, you say, all right, so what we do, we make computers. Cool. How we do it through beautifully designed products that are easy to use. Cool. Want to buy one? Not really. But if you start with the why, it changes the conversation. So if you say, all right, so we're going to sell you a laptop. Everything we do, we challenge the status quo and we think differently. How we do it is we do it through beautifully designed products that are easy to use. And what we do, we just happen to make computers. So I think it really changes the way you think about a brand, and it changes the way you think about a product. And it really is starting with why that's so important, and so many businesses don't do it. And quite often, in particular in retail, it's all about the what and the rational messaging. And actually, I'd love to touch on irrational versus emotional, because I think that's a really good segue as well. But did you guys have any questions on the Golden Circle before I go into that? Because I think that's a really key thing to think about. So you're thinking, Robin?
Yeah, because it's an interesting, because what you've said there, I think kind of closely aligns with the what's your point of difference as well. Maybe I've misunderstood it, but it feels like that's because if Apple was to have if their why was the same as someone else, they may not have stood out as much. So regardless of whether you do or don't need to be different, I think all of us starting feel like we have to have that point of difference. Otherwise, we're not going to shine through. We've got to have something that makes us unique. So if you are starting and you're trying to find that why and you can't, you just want to make furniture. Now, if I just want to make furniture, that sounds like a bit of a wishy-washy, I haven't found my why. In that scenario, should you be spending a hell of a lot of time trying to find that why, or just roll with it? You'll figure it out as you go.
Look, it depends. I think quite often businesses can just roll with it and figure it out as they go, and that's fine. I think the why is it helps sell your story. So if you just want to make furniture and the customers are flowing and you know it's all happening for you, great. You probably don't need to worry too much about it. But if you're really struggling and you're finding it really hard to sell furniture, then I would consider thinking about this stuff a little bit more and really thinking about, well, what am I telling people about why I'm doing what I'm doing? And people really care about this. Like I said earlier, particularly after the pandemic, people really want businesses that align with their values as well. And emotional thinking is what makes you memorable. So humans ultimately think emotionally. We're not rational beings whatsoever. We're actually quite emotional beings, and we inherently respond to emotional messages over rational ones. So in fact, there was a Nobel Prize winner, Danny Kahneman. He wrote a book about this sort of process of thinking fast and slow. So he specifies two types of thinking. One is system 1 and one is system 2. And ultimately, system 1 thinking is that kind of really fast, unconscious kind of thinking that we do when we're making decisions. So it's often thought to be really emotional and quite irrational. And more than 95% of our decisions are made this way. Whereas less than 5% of our decisions as human beings are made through really slow, rational kind of thinking, where we think about processing information in slow, conscious ways. So thinking about system 1 thinking, where it's really unconscious, you think about habitual purchasing at the supermarket, for example. You just buy that brand because you always do and you don't really think about it or whatever. Whereas, you know, when you think about system 2, that's when we say to people, I have a rational message about my price being down, or you know, there's this beautiful timber, or it's about the rational side of it. Whereas the emotional is kind of the storytelling piece. And ultimately, there's been loads and loads of studies done on this. But there was an author and a neurologist in '99 who said the essential difference between emotion and reason is that emotion leads to action, while reason leads to conclusion. So and time and time again, it's been proven, particularly by the IPA effectiveness body in the UK. They kind of go through advertising effectiveness, and they talk about you know, how it actually, emotional advertising increases sales more than rational advertising does, as well as, you know, fame and, you know, your brand's fame and things like that as well. So hard and soft metrics when it comes to brand improvement. So yeah, I think like ultimately emotional storytelling is more memorable and something that's going to stick in people's minds a lot more as well. So that's kind of why that why is so important, more so than the what and how.
Well, further to
it could be something as simple as like a furniture maker that makes only out of recycled timbers, but that moves to the forefront of their business rather than tables that have to be made out of recycled timbers. And then that attracts an audience that are purely looking for that recycled story.
But that's such a common one. And obviously I'm not knocking it, Bryan.
But it definitely aligns your business sort of. It tells you what your business ethics are in terms of trying to reduce your environmental footprint, reducing waste, all those kind of things. And that automatically defines you emotionally to a client. I think, yeah, okay. I don't know, I might be wrong.
I'm with you.
I completely agree, and I think you're onto something there, but I agree too, Robin, it's quite common. So what you want to think about is not the rational side of that, which is we use recycled timbers for every piece of furniture we make. It's we do not create waste in this world, or, you know, what is it that elevates it above that? What's the message that's different that's about that recycled timber? So whatever we make sure that we don't have an imprint on the earth. So it is about that kind of environmental perspective, if that's what your values are, and that's why you're doing what you're doing. So what's the why behind that,
Further to what you were saying, Robin, I think 99% of furniture makers, are inherently passionate about what they're doing. Almost everyone we've talked to started off in some other career and didn't find it fulfilling enough and wanted to move on to some creative aspect where they're making something and they were passionate about it. And if they're like me, that you'd probably do the job without pay if you could afford it. It's just something you really want to be doing. And that's kind of the messaging I've tried to put onto my website and stuff like that. And I think every maker probably should do that, because just like what Lani was saying, it immediately comes in as you can read that this person is like super passionate and will just do the job. They really want to be doing it. It's not like they're there trying to drudging through a 9 to 5. They actually want to be there, and they're going to be engaged in any communications. And I think probably all makers want to start at that point, and then from there, because it's really easy to weed out the ones that aren't passionate.
I
think
love
that's
that
really
thought.
spot on. It's like when I kind of refer to my clients as like supporters of my business. Like if I'm getting a piece delivered, I'll leave a note for them and say thank you for supporting a small creative Australian business, so that they buy into the fact that my business can't exist without them, and them being supportive allows me to do what I love.
Which, it's funny, because I used to do the same thing when I used to sell small pieces. I'd have a message similar to that, and I was always so worried that I was coming across as not disingenuous, but sort of, thank you for letting me have the life that I want. You may not have the life that you want, but you're facilitating my happiness, so screw you. I hope it never came across like that.
But people want to buy into that. Like, they want to support local businesses more so now than they ever have as well. So I think there's definitely that. And I was talking to Bryan the other night as well about the peak end rule. And you just mentioned, Bryan, that you will deliver a little note to say thank you and so on when you deliver furniture. And there's something in behavioural economics called the peak end rule. And this is all about experience. So the experience that you give your customers is that they remember an experience by the peaks and the end of that experience. So what I mean by peaks is not necessarily the positive, but the biggest emotional moments of that experience. So whether it's positive or negative, and then the end of that experience. So when we're looking at doing, consumer journeys with clients, so we look at a whole overall journey that they give to their customer, and we try and improve every stage of the journey. The advice is not always to try and improve every single thing that you do with them and every single time that you talk to them to make it incredible, but really to make sure that there's a peak in that experience that's amazing for them. But probably the biggest thing is the end of the experience. So making sure that you've got a really nice little surprise and delight moment at the end of their experience with you, and they're going to remember you a lot better than they might have otherwise. So I think that's really interesting as well. You just reminded me of that, Bryan.
Can I just stop for a second and say, I hope everyone else is finding this just gold. This is all amazing. To anyone who's running a business, this is just free, amazing stuff to think about.
Yeah, speaking of free, so you mentioned, Lani, earlier how expensive it could be to get somebody to do what you're doing and run through, like, essentially what I've found marketing people do is essentially run through a business plan really quickly with you to work out what the hell they're actually going to be employed to do. And I've had two main businesses and had probably 4 different websites built over the years, and run through this process, same kind of questions like who's your target market and all this kind of stuff. And so my question is, for a small business with the amount of DIY websites available, yes, you can save some money, I imagine, by going that road, but should you actually spend a bit more, talk to someone like yourself, maybe less qualified probably, and actually because and then after that, like, how much should a small business spend? Because it all is going to come down to how much the income is. Obviously, it's very specific. But I mean, is there a guide? I mean, because these are massive questions, and marketing costs can just skyrocket.
Definitely. Yes, there are definitely guides around marketing spend. I think if you have any kind of design bone in your body, definitely DIY, because I think particularly in furniture, there's not always a huge profit margin. So there's not always a lot of money to play with from a marketing perspective. But I think when you think about marketing driving your business, and you can see the return on the investment, then it's definitely going to help you to grow that. The kind of rule of thumb from a marketing perspective is that businesses should spend between 10 and 20% of their turnover on marketing. So it's quite a big chunk when you think about it. And I had this conversation with a small business the other day, actually, and they kind of just looked at me and went, whoa, we're currently spending 2%. And I was like, okay. And they're kind of asking me advice on how to get, more business. I'm like, well, marketing helps you to get business. So you need to spend money to make money sometimes. But it depends on whether you've even got that money to start with. And I think sometimes a lot of furniture makers are just trying to make ends meet. So it's not always possible. So you've really got to consider like what you can actually afford to invest in your business. But yeah, if you cannot design a website for the life of you, I would definitely invest in that, because it needs to look aesthetically good. Otherwise, no one's going to bother. But if you don't need a website, great, use Instagram or a free platform. Not everyone needs a website these days. I think we were talking about this
the other week, were we? We were saying that websites are becoming less and less useful. Like, they might be a small folio of your work, but it can literally be 5 pages of a website, as opposed to mine that probably has 100 pages on it, and every time I want to update it or if I want to change the look of it, I've got to go through those 100 pages.
Yes.
So I think the DIY websites are fine, so long as you've got some good photography is probably more important. Good photography and good branding, rather than
like what we've
a
just been saying.
hugely deep website.
Yeah,
agree.
So when you're saying spend, Lani, where would you recommend people spend? Is it in adverts? Is it in paying a consultant? Or where, like, if you're a small business and you've got, say, $2,000 or something that you want to assign to a marketing budget, where would you put it?
It depends where you're at in your journey as a business. So if you've already got a logo set up and you've already got your branding and you're quite happy with that, then obviously you don't need to spend there. But that's probably a first point, is just making sure that you've got great branding, because that's really important, and really simple branding. So a lot of logos these days have simplified over time as well, because we look at our phones and things are so small. They need to be really, really simple kind of logos these days. But ultimately, it depends, like I said, where you're at in your journey. So if you're all established with your brand, that's great, and you've got a website, amazing, then think about chipping in a little bit of money from a social media spend, or Google search spend, or AdWords or whatever. I think it's getting to the top of that search term from a website's perspective is really important. But again, knowing your audience is also important for this, because if you have an audience of, and I know I mentioned think about attitudes, not always demographics, but if you do think that your audience are younger, they're probably not going to be necessarily always searching online. From a Google perspective, it might be more that they're in Instagram searching for inspiration. And so, linking yourself to other businesses is really important, and making partnerships and getting your name out there that way is really important, as opposed to necessarily doing paid spend. And then stories are really important. TikTok's huge, obviously, with a lot of younger people, but it's also becoming bigger with older people now as well. So that's a really good platform at the moment, and it's only growing as well. My sister is obsessed with it, and she's 40, so Bryan will tell you all about that. And so it depends on your journey, and it depends on your audience in terms of how you're going to spend that in terms of media or marketing dollars. But I think definitely just make sure that you set up really well. Great brand, maybe a basic website at minimum, just even if it's a landing page with contact details at worst, just so that when people are searching for you, they can find you. I think the only issue with that, though, is that your SEO is going to be really crap.
Yeah.
So search engine optimization, and that just means that you'll be ranked really low and people won't find you. So I guess when you do think about websites, you need to think about that as well. And I don't think websites are null and void. I think they are phasing out slightly because people are looking elsewhere, but I think people are definitely still searching for businesses online. So it's definitely something I wouldn't ignore. I would probably, if
But
you
it
could
could
afford
literally
to have
be
one.
it could literally be like a Shopify page or something rather than being a full website.
Definitely. Yeah, do the basic level that you need to, I think. Yeah.
I think it legitimizes you.
Yeah.
Jamie, my wife, the other day was saying, I can't remember, one of her clients or the organizations that she works with emailed her from a Gmail account. And she said, how can this company have a Gmail account? And today, when it's so easy to get a domain, all you're saying when you get a landing site is, I value what I do. So I've made minimum effort and put in minimum costs into promoting that.
I must say the gmail.com at the end it just looks so unprofessional.
When you could have had it for free up until 3 days ago.
Yeah.
Oh, righto. Really?
Bastards started charging for it. $6 a month to have your email hosted through Gmail now. But again, it's like $6 a month. You know, it's going to cost me $70 a year versus emailing a client at gmail.com and them going, who is this?
Yeah. It's such a poor look.
I use their business suites. I've been paying for it for a while.
Yeah, cool.
I just want to go back though to the peak end rule and just considering, so I know we're talking about furniture makers not necessarily having a huge amount of money to invest in marketing, but word of mouth is the strongest marketing channel you will ever have.
Mm-hmm.
And word of mouth by means of customers explaining that to others, but also sharing it on their social media as well. So that's where that kind of end experience or that peak experience is really important, so that people want to share their experience with others in a good way, not a bad way, about you as well. That's really important. Word of mouth is your strongest channel.
Yeah, I'm Bryan might have an idea on this as well. I think at first for a new business, you obviously don't have any word of mouth. You need to have some marketing. You need to put yourself out. And over the years, I've found I'm doing less and less marketing and more repeat customers and word of mouth customers. And that is probably not a good business model for a business who's looking for year-on-year growth, like your cliche larger business. But I feel that most furniture makers aren't looking just to exponentially grow their business. They're trying to grow it to the point which is sustainable to a level where they are comfortable with in their life, and they want it to plateau, which most businesses, when I've spoken to business advisors, they just look at you like you're an imbecile, like you. That doesn't compute because they don't have any. There's no systems for plateau. It's all got to be growth. And so, Bryan, how do you find being in the business for as long?
I do agree with you. Like, I've definitely spent less on marketing in the second 5 years to the first 5 years, and I caught myself on that, and I'm like, right, well, I've got to do something. So I was thinking, I want to go higher end, and I want to tap into. I don't have a good network with interior designers. I've got an okay one with architects, but I was like, how do I actually reach them? And yeah, you can do it, analytics and people that are interested in design and stuff, but usually people that are interested in design don't have money. Like they tend to be design students. So I'm spending all my money to target design students. So I was like, right, I'll spend I spent $2,500 or $3,000 making brochures.
Yep.
So nice A5 hardback booklets that I posted out to 140 or 150 different architects and interior designers.
Nice.
With a handwritten note. Like, it took a fucking long time. But handwritten note, and the postage costs were huge. Printing costs were huge. But I definitely did get a good return on jobs out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And they're identifiable. I had architects, like directors of large firms, because I would always address it either to, if I knew it was a large firm, I would sort of go to the person that managed the library. Like, you can sort of work out, it's usually an interior designer. If it's a smaller firm, like a sort of an 8 to 10 person practice, like I used to work at, always address it to the director.
Right.
And I got emails directly back from directors saying, "Oh, thanks for sending it through. You know, definitely keep you in mind on future projects." And then you've got your little hook, as opposed to if I just email them directly, like I'm not going to get a reply. No. But it's just the fact that I've taken the time to give them something physical. It's then going to end up in a trade library or something like that, and it's not just pissing the money away to Google or Facebook.
It's one of the things.
But I don't know. It doesn't work for everyone, I'm sure, but it worked. It worked for me. I think it was worth it.
It worked for me when I was a builder. I did the same thing.
It's one of the things, Joey, that you said many episodes ago, and it stuck with me. I think we might have been talking about setting up an account, or trying to get materials or something. You said a lot of people today won't just pick up the phone and call. You know, because that's too much effort for a lot of people. So I guess if you are ever doing something like that, what you're talking about, Bryan, if what you're doing is easy, it's probably not going to work. Or if it costs nothing, it's not going to work.
Yes, right. Yeah, put some effort into it.
And I think by even just making sure you know who the directors are, I think that was really, people understand that you've taken that time. You've almost identified your influencers in a way. Like, you've done an influencer strategy, influencer campaign where you've gone, right, who are the influencers, who's going to get me lots of business, not just a one-off sale. I think that's really clever. Yeah.
Cool.
You go, Joe.
I had a funny little... Be careful, though, because... I had planned, I was trying, back when I was heavy into YouTube, and I wanted to get a full-time sponsor, and I found this New Zealand company that I thought would be a great fit. Found out who the director was online, did some research, and I was like, right, I'll call and leave a message, blah, 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 blah. So I immediately get put straight through to the director. He's just like, what do you want? and I was just like...
Pitch it.
Yeah, it was
Pitch it
just...
now.
Crickets on the end of the phone. I was like, and he's like, "You're wasting my time." Bang, hangs up the phone. Well, that was it. Like, one and only chance. So be prepared to actually say what you need to say as well, because you could lose it.
That's awful.
That's a great point, Joey. That's another thing we talk about in marketing is have your elevator pitch prepared.
Yes.
So, like, for anyone that doesn't know what that means, it's like if you're in an elevator with someone, how would you sell them your business in the 10 seconds that you've got, really? And it's like, what is it about you that's interesting and different that you can say in 10 seconds?
Yes.
But yeah, having that elevator pitch prepared is really important.
Yeah, that was a big wake up call for me. I was like, well, I'm never going to do that again.
Lani, you were mentioning earlier about the peak and the end. So have you ever had, and I'm looking for ideas for people, have you ever had any really memorable, with your clients, any memorable ending strategies? I don't know if that's the right term, or something that you could relate to what we do.
Probably one of the most simple forms that I can think of is when you deliver a product, and it's the tone of voice that you take. So the tone of voice, how relatable that is, but also if you give a little gift. So, for example, I know a lot of makeup brands or skincare, they'll send you a little box and it'll be like, "Hi babe, how's it going?" And like, it's a really casual conversation.
I
they know their
audience.
You get it all the time. And they might send you, like, Adore Beauty sends you a little Tim Tam, and a lot of different samples. Mecca sends you lots of samples. Frank Body uses very, risque kind of tone of voice and their language. You know, they'll have a coffee scrub and be like, I'm going to get you naked later, and, you know, things like that. And it's just like, that's memorable stuff because it's emotional. And so I think it is like, what's that little gift at the end? So, for example, I know Brian's done a lot of little cheese boards for clients when they order a big piece of furniture. And it's this tiny little thing. It's, you know, a little bit of effort for him to do, but it's worth it because it's a little surprise and delight at the end of it to be like, here, and I've also made you this, and it's, you know, a nice little memento for them to have as well. So I think that little gift at the end, or, you know, something at the end, is always a really nice kind of little surprise and delight moment.
Yeah, little gift is good. I have a little eco pack pencil pen ruler thing I give to the clients, wrapped up in the bill. And,
love it.
And you know, you mentioned just before, Lani, about delivering the product, and obviously you meant, like, I think what you were meaning is actually when it gets posted, not actually physically handing it over, but 99% of the times we're physically taking the piece of the furniture, and most of the time clients are seeing at least progress pictures of what you've done, or maybe even some kind of finished pictures, but there's nothing like seeing it in person. And I still, to this day, and I've talked about it before, this massive imposter syndrome where it's not good enough, they're going to spot something that's not quite good enough, and you're just sweating beads, and it's very difficult to be upbeat and positive when you think you're about to, like, you know, that they're going to say, I hate it. Because, you know, they're not going to, and no one's done that. But it's very, I think, for new furniture makers especially, or any makers who are making a handmade product, you've got to stand behind your product or what it is, and be proud of it, even though you're shitting yourself that they're gonna hate what you've made. And it's a tough thing to learn, because I'm still struggle with it every time I deliver something.
So when I was up in Townsville, Laura McCusker sent a piece to a client up there, and it was broken, and she asked me to fix it, right? And then I delivered it to the clients. And you know how different the experience was when I was delivering a piece that I just fixed. It wasn't mine. If they didn't like it, I didn't care. It was so nice. It was relaxed. I could just hand it over, and from their perspective, I'm sure they saw the confidence in me and thought, we're going to get this guy to work for us next time, because he's solid. He's got no fear. So, yeah, something to think about.
It's so true, isn't it? Confidence eludes that confidence in the customer as well. But, like, I mean, of all people, like, strategists like myself are known to have imposter syndrome as well, so I can completely relate to that. You know, what if people don't understand, or what if they don't believe me, or whatever. But I think it's a really great point, and confidence is so important to help that client sell it. But you can't control what you can't control either. And if you've never had those bad experiences in the past, you can't kind of expect to have them in the future either. So, yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? How do you deal with it,
coffee,
Brian?
you know? Get yourself really buzzed before you deliver something, and so you're bouncing off the walls. It is hard. I remember I used to get very nervous about it for the same reasons, Joey. You'd be thinking, God, maybe they'll look at the back of that drawer and see that, you know, it's not grain matched, or just something stupid. But I don't know. Now I think I've reached the point where I'm excited to deliver pieces. Like, I'm proud of the finished result. I've communicated to the client from the sketch process. You know, they've engaged with that part. I've shown them on social media. I've shown them the making of it. And then this is just the completion of that story. And if they've been happy all the way through there, they've been happy with the design, I've shown them all the effort and the ways in which I've gone to making the piece, that the delivery should just be the icing on the cake for them. And that should be that's the easiest bit, really. Well, unless you're going up 4 flights of stairs in Hardware Lane and having to cut apart a steel table because the client couldn't measure a doorway. Just as a hypothetical.
I wasn't going to bring it
never
up.
happened.
But yeah, I think Lani's spot on when she says about the tone of it. Like, just to sound excited to be delivering the piece, I think is a really important thing. Rather than sounding tired and, you know, exhausted, which you might well be, but just, yeah, like I said, get a few coffees into you and really perk yourself up for what should be the exciting part of the...
Optimistic, not pessimistic.
Optimistic, not pessimistic, yeah.
Just to add to that, not just about delivering furniture and confidence, but around tone, that's a huge part of brand. So brand isn't always just a logo. Brand is your tone of voice and how you talk as a brand. It's music. Like, music can be a huge indicator of a brand and like a great memorability thing. So, you know, music on a podcast or whatever. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it triggers memories, and they're what we call brand attributes. And all of those attributes build up a brand, not just a logo. So it could even be a character, or like, God forbid, or it could be you know, you're your brand as well. So, yeah, just keeping that in mind as well, that a brand's not just a logo, it's the whole story behind it. And I think tone of voice is something that's really underutilised in the furniture industry. I think it could be used more as, you know, what's your tone of voice? Is it quirky? Is it funny? Is it different? Is it sharp? Is it witty? Is it serious? You know, just asking yourself that question.
I think that's something that you
cool.
really got me to think about, Lani, was probably my first 5 years of my business. I referred to my, like, when I was talking about my business and social media, I referred to it in the third person. Yeah, always third person. It's like we. Yeah. I'm just one person in there most of the time, but yeah, it's still we.
A lot of people do
and
that.
And then I think it is just the imposter syndrome kicking in, and then you reach a point where you're like, well, hang on.
Yeah, it's just me.
I am my brand, so why don't I just be me?
Yep.
And it can be, like, although I try to target sort of mid to high end clients, I find that I'm not getting many of them through Instagram anyway. They might come to my Instagram once they've commissioned me for the piece. But I find that keeping a more informal tone was just a better reflection of me. Trying to have an Instagram feed that was maybe 90% of photos in my workshop and 10% of, you know, beautiful glossy photos, as opposed to 5 years before that, I was like, oh no, these have to be gallery grade, you know, white background, everything's got to be perfect. And then I reached a point where I was like, it's just not being authentic to who I am.
That's exactly why, like this year, I think it is, I changed all my branding, and not I'm using my name as my company name. It's not because got bad advice early on to say never use your own name, and then actually in the business we're into, that's what you want. You want your name to be associated with all the things you're associated with.
Exactly why I changed mine. It also just stops you from being tied down to something in particular. You know, if you want to branch off King Post metalwork, you know, you can do that.
We talked about that for you, didn't we, Bryan? And I think now, like, so many people know Sawdust Bureau, it's almost detrimental to change it. But I remember talking to you about it years ago, being like, why don't you just be Bryan Cush? Yeah. Like, you design it, you make it, just
drop it.
You know. Yeah, but I think now it's almost like it's not too late, but I think, you know, it could be detrimental because people might talk about Sawdust Bureau and it's changed. But
yeah, that's what I'm having that trouble, like trying to actually get rid of one brand, and I've got bits and pieces on my website. I've got and I'm dealing with older clients who don't know what this branding is, and so there's this whole transition period which I hope will be over and done with by the end of the year. But it certainly is not cheap either, changing all the branding.
No.
It actually costs money, even though we don't have big signage and stuff. You still have got to do new artwork. There's lots of things where you've just spent time and effort, and eventually the branding gets changed, but it's not that easy.
It's a process. It takes years. I think Vic Roads took about 3 years to change their brand from memory. Like, it can take years to transition, like just because they had all their signs on road signs and things like that. But it does cost money. I think the key, though, the biggest thing is, as part of that, is just to be really authentic and honest always in everything that you do, and, you know, live your values unapologetically and be okay with that, because customers see through you and they're not stupid. People know exactly what you're talking about, you know, when you're honest, when you're not. And I think really just being authentic and honest is what people value these days from brands. And they want them to act with responsibility. So, yeah, that's probably a key thing to think about too.
Awesome.
Righto, we have exactly 5 minutes before we've got to shut this thing down. Is there anything anyone else wants to talk about? Lani, are there any other gems that you want to drop on us before we close up?
Look, I think the biggest thing is really what I was just talking about around being honest and authentic. I think one thing that I found, I did a talk recently at a summit, and I had to look into the effects of the pandemic and how everyone's feeling, and we're pretty much collectively traumatized around the world. And if we say we're not, we're lying, or we're in denial. But ultimately, we need to act with empathy as brands. So whenever we're working with people, we need to make sure that we're being really empathetic. We also need to make them feel safe. And what I mean by that is kind of making them feel safe, both emotionally and physically. And then we also need to think about kind of building trust through that authenticity. They're kind of the three things that I kind of thought about. And building trust through things like values. So environmental issues are one of the biggest things that people care about at the moment in the world. So particularly younger people, but I think overall that's like one of the biggest things that comes out for people. So yeah, I think as long as you're authentic in your brand, in everything that you're doing to build that trust, I think customers will want to buy into that, and they'll see that and they'll want to be part of it. So yeah, and don't be afraid to be you as the brand. So I think that's awesome, Joey, that you've done that. And Robin, you did it too.
Yeah. So and everyone referring to ourselves as we. Man, that's a common thing. Eh? That is a common thing.
Bryan has been we quite a few times, so it's confusing, isn't it? Like, you know, you've quite often got people working with you, and then, you know, quite often you don't. So it's a bit tricky. You know, if you said I, it might not make sense for you, I think.
Often I feel like you say it because you want to seem like you're legitimate to the client, especially for me when it's a bigger client and they're thinking by what they see online, and then they expect that there's, you know, 10 staff or something.
A team,
and so then you kind of start saying we to make yourself feel like you're putting the right message across, but actually it probably is the opposite.
It's detrimental because they know that if it was a bigger company, a lot of the job is going to be done by somebody else other than you, the face of your business, and the one who's designed it, and the one who's
I've had that before. Actually,
it's a hard thing.
I've had someone say, "Are you going to do it, or someone else?" And so then you've got to make that split decision where, no, actually, I will be the one that's doing the work. Oh, that's okay then, because we don't want someone else to do it. And so you have to understand it when you're getting started that people do sometimes want that very unique, one of a kind thing. They don't want it just to be passed off and go into a production line.
Yeah, right on.
Yeah, and that's probably why they're buying into your brand for that reason, or it might be one of the reasons. Yeah.
All right, Lani. Well, thanks so much. I didn't have any expectations for the show, but I feel like we have certainly met them and more. I hope everyone listening has got a lot out of this. I think obviously this has been more aimed at our business owner listeners out there. Some real gold. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great chatting with you guys.
Yeah, and it's good to finally have a family member on the show. We need to do that, Joey. We need to get our.
I'll bring my 7-year-old on.
Our better halves on. Give you the real truth.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, and just send Robin the invoice. That'd be great, Lani.
Yeah, shit.
Okay, cool. Yeah. No worries.
All right, everyone. Thanks again. Take care, and we'll see you in the next show.
Thanks, guys.
See ya. Bye.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.